Political parties are pushing back against growing calls for greater transparency in the funding of their operations 4 years after the Political Party Funding Act was introduced. Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, Musa Chabane, announced that the National Assembly would revisit proposed amendments to the Act. It comes amid ongoing concerns over political parties' perceived resistance to increased scrutiny of donations from public contributors. Political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze joins us for more. Professor Kotze, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, political parties have been tussling over this matter of transparency of donations. They want more money and less transparency of who their donors are. What's to be made of such a position?
Good evening. I think the first reason for that is that they argue that there's a reduction in their income because especially donors who are maybe in the lower ranks, just above 100,000, don't want to be seen to donate to these different political parties and therefore refrain from doing it. So they argue that instead of increasing their income, it is actually causing a reduction of their income in proportional terms. So in that sense, I think they say, well, the alternative is that the public funding by Parliament must increase. And that at the moment is also not really possible given the fiscal situation. So that is the main reason why they are pushing back. This is something which they were actually never be satisfied with. Since the Act was passed, there was always a pushback by the different parties, especially by the ANC, that they felt that this is limiting the potential income.
How important is the issue around transparency, party funding, in terms of public trust, satisfaction, and aspects around engagement with democracy?
It is absolutely important, and that is where, as you refer to, public trust comes in. I think the public in general wants to know whether there are some funders who have extraordinary influence in political parties, and very specifically the majority party or the governing parties at the different levels, because it applies not only to the national level but also to the provincial level, not at the moment at local level. So what is important is that they want to see whether, for example, there's big companies, big corporates that are involved or behind some of these political parties, or whether there's different financial interests that are providing very specific type of support, because it's not only financial, it's also support in kind that the Act is referring to. So it can be in terms of, for example, providing facilities, providing transport, providing accommodation, like hotel groups and others. So these are all aspects that the public wants to know. In other countries, there are different ways of approaching it. There's, for example, limitations on the total amount of money that political parties can spend in an election, like in the US, or there's limits on the number of the total amount of money that any person can donate. Like in the US, there they have alternatives, what they call PACs, action committees. So there are very different approaches. In some countries, the main form of income that parties receive is from the public purse, from Parliament and government. So South Africa will have to find a model, because at the moment, I think most people will say it's not satisfactory. But the reports that are and the disclosures made to the IEC on a regular basis by political parties are difficult to imagine that that's their total income.
Yeah. So how is this legislation, the Political Party Funding Act, how is it now providing legislation around imposing certain restrictions on the source and the use of such donations, which in essence would cause some sort of discomfort?
Well, in the first instance, what you refer to is the minimum threshold in order to disclose, and that's 100,000.
Yes.
The maximum that a donor can give per annum to a political party, that is 15 million at the moment. Then there's also restrictions, for example, on foreign donations. Foreign governments and foreign institutions are not allowed to give or donate money to any political parties, except if it is for very specific purposes, like training, for example. The gap that I myself identified in the process in the parliamentary hearings is that there's no restrictions on funding by foreign political parties to South African parties. So it's party-to-party funding. The Act is not saying anything about that. Then there's also, for example, money that has been used for fraudulent purposes that should not be donated. As to prevent, for example, that money laundering and other forms are going through these funding processes and similar situations. So there are some restrictions.
Would you say, I mean, just touching back on the conversation around public trust, would you say increasing transparency in political party funding increases voters' trust? Because already there is an element of distrust or mistrust as we take a look at voters and perceptions around political parties.
Yes, I think the notion of trust or lack of trust is something which consists of many elements, of which this is one, but not the only one. And I would say not the main one. I think trust is more about, for example, the way in which parties are acting internally in terms of their own procedures, the way in which nominations are taking place, the way in which there's some parties, some persons or groups are favored above others or suppressed from participating. And then also trust about the ethical quality of the candidates in elections, the ethical quality of the political party. So these are very important aspects of public trust. And it is not, I would say, not in the first instance about who they are funded by, but rather what is the internal conduct and also the external conduct of political parties.
What's your view? I mean, you say that perhaps they'll never agree. They'll never agree and come to one voice or on particular aspects of this act. I mean, what is your take on its impact and the general consensus that should be reached in really just agreeing to disagree?
Well, I think we are quite a distance away from any form of consensus. I think where the main difference in terms of opinion is very much between, on the one hand, political parties, and on the other hand, watchdogs, like especially civil society organizations, that in the past have pushed the hardest in order to get to the point where we are now. It did not come necessarily from the public in general, but it came from these civil society organizations, NGOs, who pushed very hard, starting with IDASA more than 15 years ago. Where it is. So I think it will have to require that there's more of an understanding between the political parties and Parliament in general and these civil society organizations.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on the discussion. We're going to have to leave it there for now, wrapping up that conversation with political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze.